Hi, I'm Max Bergmann.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Hi, I'm Will Todman, and I'm the host of a new CSIS podcast on foreign policy and geopolitics called State of Play. This week, I chatted with Victor Cha and Max Bergmann about how US allies and autocrats are managing President Trump. I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please check out State of Play wherever you get your podcasts. So August hasn't been a quiet month for US diplomacy. After the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, European leaders met with President Trump in the White House. And then this week, President Trump also held his first summit with South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung. So 7 months into the Trump administration, I think some patterns are starting to emerge now about how world leaders are approaching President Trump. The first Oval Office meeting with Zelensky showed us what happens when they try to push back against the president. Then we've seen lots of efforts of leaders trying to ingratiate themselves with him, from royal invitations to compliments about the state of the US economy. And then some autocrats have also sought to engage with Trump in these historic peace talks with quite a lot of fanfare. So the question we're here to answer today is, who is doing better? Are US allies or autocrats managing President Trump better? And today we're reconvening the duo that kicked off State of Play. So Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, and also the Korea Chair. Victor, we're grateful you're here because you were meant to be in Korea, but I think the reason you're not in Korea is because you had quite a special guest this week.
Yes, we did. We actually have our big annual conference in Korea. It was on Tuesday, Korea time, which is Monday evening U.S. time. But then 8 days ago, we were asked by the South Korean government to host the president of South Korea after his White House meetings on Monday. So we got stuck having actually two events in Seoul and in Washington on the same day. And Dr. Hamry and I were uncertain of what to do because we put like 6 months into planning the thing in Korea. But then in the end, we kind of had this aha moment where we said, President of South Korea is coming to the White House, and then he wants to come to CSIS. This is like our Super Bowl, right?
Yeah.
So we have to be here. So yeah. That's why I'm still in DC. Yes.
And not only did you have him for the public remarks, but then you also had dinner with him. So I'm excited to hear a bit about what you learned.
Yes. We had a good dinner. We had a private reception in the beginning with some of our board members and VIPs and his public speech. And then we hosted a private dinner for him afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And Max Bergmann, the director of the Stewart Center and also director of the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program. Putin tried to ruin your holiday.
I think he succeeded.
Succeeded.
Well,
How so?
You couldn't get Putin to come to CSIS, Max?
Well, I was in Provence, relaxing in France, and then suddenly like, what is happening at the end of this week? Putin's coming to America, and so he didn't fully ruin it.
Okay,
but
good.
It required me to pay a bit more attention to the news than I probably would have otherwise.
But not the quiet August I think many of us hoped for or expected. So Victor, I want to start with you and with focusing on allies and looking at this Trump-Lee summit. And just before the meeting, President Trump posted on Truth Social, in all caps, "What is going on in South Korea? Seems like a purge or revolution. We can't have that and do business there." So it seemed like things were going to be a bit rocky, but then it actually ended up going much smoother. So what did President Lee tell you about kind of how he turned things around and ultimately like how things went?
Yeah, so I think that Truth Social tweet was a curveball that nobody expected in the morning. I think there was outright panic, I think, both in the U.S. and the South Korean delegations. The people who staff a summit meeting like this, first meeting between the two leaders. He tried to meet with Trump in Canada at the G7, and Trump left a day early because of the Iran attack. They were thinking of going to The Hague for the NATO Leaders Summit to try to meet with Trump, and in the end, they decided at the last minute not to go. So this was a big meeting, big important meeting. And then literally hours before the meeting, he posts this thing on True Social about, purges and raiding of churches in Korea. And then what wasn't is that then they delayed the meeting by an hour. They delayed the start of the meeting by an hour. So people were pretty freaked out. They were pretty freaked out. But in the end, I think what we saw Lee do was not uncommon among many allies, in the sense that once they're in the Oval Office, they certainly do nothing to embarrass the president. They do nothing to push back or criticize the president. And then they press all the right buttons, right? And the first thing I remember that President Lee said to Trump was, Mr. President, since you've been president of the United States, the Dow is through the roof, right? And that's like that's language he understands, right? And,
didn't he say something about how like all the gold is really lovely in the Oval Office? Or I thought he maybe complimented the decor.
I think he did that. I think he did that as well. And then he talked about other things, about Trump being a peace builder, and then he talked about real estate. He talked about there should be a Trump Tower in North Korea. There should be a Trump golf course in North Korea. So finding all the right buttons to press and using speaking in a language that they know Trump resonates with Trump. And I think that's what. But the other thing I would say about Lee was that he was also very comfortable sitting in the Oval Office. His body language was very positive. I don't know if you saw it, Matt. He was sitting on the edge of the chair, the edge of the chair and the corner, leaning directly into President Trump. And so he there was a lot on the line, but he performed well, I think.
He's a skilled politician, right? I mean, even just at CSIS, like he seemed really comfortable answering questions, and I think seems to enjoy speaking publicly.
I think that's right. It was actually surprising to me because I had not met him before. Dr. Hamry had met him before, but I had not met him before. And he was very comfortable for a first visit to the United States. He doesn't speak any English, everything in a foreign language. He was extremely comfortable. In the dinner off script, he was very comfortable too. So that was something that was surprising. He did say that what they wanted to avoid was what he called the Zelensky moment in the Oval Office, and so clearly he prepped to ensure that was not going to happen.
And Max, have other European leaders presumably learned from the Zelensky moment as well? What lessons have they learned about how to engage with President Trump?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually think part of the reason why Zelensky back in that February Oval Office meeting pushed back on Trump and sort of stood up for himself was actually because Emmanuel Macron had successfully done it sort of the week before. And I think it's sort of a different political context where if Trump had gotten into a big row with Macron, that's like great for Macron politically, who's struggling, back in France, standing up against the Americans. And so I think each European leader, the European advantage here is they can sort of flood the zone with so many different types of European leaders. You have Giorgia Meloni of Italy, who is, sort of an ideological compatriot with the president. Friedrich Merz, when he came, was a bit more, he's sort of the kind of stern German, a little bit of a hard man. And he gave Trump a little bit, but was obsequious. And I think what the Europeans in general did when they came after the Anchorage meeting to back Zelensky. I mean, their whole purpose was basically to act as Zelensky's bodyguard. Now, there were some in the UK that were like, well, we're not sure exactly where, if Trump starts going after Zelensky, what side would Starmer take? Because the UK has been probably the most obsequious in trying to engage with Trump. But they were sort of there to try to just kind of police the meeting in some ways and hope that it went well, and they all praised him. And I think for everyone, all the allies seem to be adopting the kind of same stance of praising Trump, not trying to pick a fight, trying to avoid kind of tensions escalating. But what's interesting in Europe, and Victor, I'm very curious for your take on what's happening in Korea, also in Japan. Then Europe, after the US-EU trade deal that was announced in Turnberry, Scotland, where Ursula von der Leyen came with the EU delegation to effectively bend the knee. And this was a really tough pill for the EU itself to swallow because they had been ready to hit back. They had a secret working group that they had set up inside the European Commission for a year to think about, what targets they were going to go after, Boeing and Bourbon and other things like that. And yet they sort of bent the knee and kind of accepted US was going to, 15% tariffs and they weren't going to retaliate. Um, and von der Leyen has been utterly pilloried, as well as other European leaders for the humiliation of looking so weak. And I'm curious, in Korea, has that reaction been similar? Has this been seen as sort of a humiliation of just sort of accepting U.S. tariffs and not standing up to a president that is in some ways undermining the
Yeah, no,
alliance?
I think it's different. I mean, I think well, first, I think that when we saw Liberation Day and the reciprocal tariffs, the Europeans were willing to sort of stand up a little bit more to Trump than the European allies were willing to stand up more to Trump than like Japan and Korea. Like Japan and Korea, their immediate reaction is, okay, like what kind of deal can we make? Whereas, the Europeans who are going to retaliate, Canada retaliated and others. So I think that's a little bit different. And maybe it's in part because their domestic audience expects that. I think in Japan and Korea, the United States is the ally. It is the key ally in a neighborhood where there are lots of people that are not that friendly: China, Russia, North Korea. So they really look to resolve the problem as quickly as they can. I mean, this is paraphrasing, but I think the immediate reaction in Japan and Korea and among the domestic publics was, okay, what kind of deal can we, like, what is the deal that the United States wants? Let's see if we can do it. Whereas, the European response was much more about, like, you're destroying the world order and like you're destroying the free trade order. And, I think the publics maybe have that expectation of their leadership. So, in this particular summit, I think, both the Koreans and the Japanese, when they got their deal, went back, and it was generally supported, I think. Having said that, though, I think the Asian leaders know you don't embarrass Trump in public, in the Oval. You don't embarrass him, but that doesn't mean you can't have tough negotiations behind closed doors. And so what we saw in the aftermath of the Lee summit, like the big non-story of the summit, is it's the first summit meeting. There's no written document. Right? There's no there's no vision statement. There's no joint declaration. There's no joint statement. There's not even a joint press briefing. There's no fact sheet. And that's because they couldn't reach agreement on some of the difficult economic issues. So I think, that the main thing Asian leaders take is that they don't want the president to make the president look bad in public, but they're still willing to have the tough negotiations behind the scenes.
But that also implies then that the success in the public sphere in front of the press in the Oval Office does not necessarily translate to a success in private. So maybe they're managing President Trump better, in a public facing way, but is still not maybe getting more out of him. Is that the same in Europe? Do you think? Is there a feeling that they're not getting enough out of the president in private?
Well, I think it's not about getting enough out of him. I think they're more worried about, okay, the EU got a deal on trade, but is this the end of the story? Or is this just, one phase of the negotiation? We're now seeing Trump really targeting EU digital rules and regulations. Does that bring the trade conversation back into it? And I think I think Victor is hit the nail on the head. For the Europeans in particular, agreeing to this deal where they're not going to reciprocate or retaliate on tariffs, it sort of goes against the whole the WTO rules and most favored nation provisions. And so it sort of begins to upend the global trading order. There's been a lot of criticism in Europe of you're effectively going along with, you're making that concession that the global trading order is melting away, when Europe had been maybe the last holdouts really trying to uphold a rules-based trading order at the WTO. So I think, and the one point I would sort of disagree with Victor is that, the Europeans now, unlike probably in the first Trump term, are very concerned about their security, obviously with Russia, with the Ukraine war. And I think that was why they ultimately I bent the knee, so to speak, is that the EU was willing to hit back, but European member states were like, okay, we got through the NATO summit that happened in July. Trump didn't walk away from NATO. there's a big gap in our security, that if the U.S. were to walk away from NATO, we would have a big problem. And we need the U.S. for Ukraine still. So I think the security element has really put a damper on European willingness to punch back. But we'll see if this sort of continues to sprawl into other areas and of domestic policy, like digital regulations.
But even the language Max uses of like the Europeans feel like they had to bend the knee, like they wouldn't use that language to describe like what the Japanese and Korean leaders did. They'd be just like, they got it, they got a deal. We got through the summit. It was a success. So there, I think the way it's described also tells you something about the way European leaders look at managing Trump versus Asian leaders. So,
Interesting.
Yeah. And what's interesting just in Europe is that it was like completely cross-cutting the criticism of the EU. It was Mary Le Pen, Viktor Orban, called von der Leyen like a featherweight or a lightweight. And it was from the right, from the left, from the center. It was sort of everyone was like very kind of upset with what happened.
So let's turn to autocrats now, and let's start with Putin. So we're nearly 2 weeks out from the Anchorage summit between President Trump and President Putin. I think immediately afterwards, there was quite a lot of discussion about what Putin had gained, like the end of international isolation, the sort of prestige of having this red carpet and the images of the US soldiers, bending down on their knees to lots of bending the knee today.
Lots of knee bending.
But now are things changing a bit? Like, Max, what's your assessment of what Putin got out of Trump and how he's managing President Trump?
The way I described it to one reporter is that it's a little bit like when I take my kids to the playground and they want to get on the merry-go-round and they're sort of all excited and they get on and you spin them around, they're excited and they sort of get dizzy, you get a little sick, and then you get off exactly where you got on, right? There's been a lot of activity, not a lot of progress. And I think for all that, for all the pomp and circumstance and you could describe it as sort of embarrassing how Trump reacted to Putin, I think clearly trying to put on a good show and sort of use his charisma to try to hopefully entice Putin into sort of a peace agreement. Nothing really came of it. In fact, they skipped lunch, and it's never good when you have a summit and you don't eat. And I think it was a sign that Putin wasn't enticed by the what Trump was offering, the economic deals that were purportedly on the table. And Putin sort of offered a poison pill offer of, we want these territorial concessions. We want land that Russia currently doesn't occupy. Ukraine was never going to go for that. And so I don't think much really came out of the summit. I think it is helpful for Russia in kind of a global perspective of being let out of the penalty box somewhat. But we're sort of in the same place where we were before the kind of all this activity happened during my vacation.
And someone that I think hasn't been talked about as much recently is Kim Jong-un. And Victor, how is it right that he doesn't seem to have attempted anything with Trump yet, or at least that we know of? Like, how would you assess his strategy of dealing with the US?
Right now, he's playing hard to get for certain because he has a new dance partner in Vladimir Putin. Because of the war in Ukraine and the 6 million plus rounds of ammunition that North Korea has provided, 20,000 troops, $12 billion that they've gotten in return, plus who knows what else. He's sitting pretty right now. And so he's kind of playing hard to get. Trump, as he did with Putin, Trump, I don't know if he likes autocrats, but he's very willing to engage with them to see if he can get what he wants, right? And to put aside all of sort of, this is not the right word, but in quotation marks, the pretense sort of American exceptionalism and everything, and say, I'm happy to talk to whoever, and I'm happy to talk to Putin, invite him to Alaska, happy to talk to Kim Jong-un. He talked about when he stepped across the DMZ line and like people were going crazy, he saw all these rifles pointed at him. So I think that sort of really leaning forward is something that we've seen Trump do with Putin. We've seen him do it with Kim Jong-un. The other thing is that he did the exact same thing to Kim Jong-un the last time they met in Vietnam that he did to Putin, which was when there was no deal there, he walked away. He skipped the lunch in Hanoi too. There was, I mean, I was covering the summit from New York City for NBC, and we did the initial press spray, and then they said you can't, because this was because of time difference. It was like 1 a.m. or something. Like, you can go back to the hotel. As soon as I got back to the hotel, it was me and Wendy Sherman. They called us back and they said, you have to come back because the summit is breaking up. And we're like, what about lunch? And he goes, he's skipping lunch. So when I saw the story about Alaska skipping lunch, I thought, wow, he does things very similarly, both on the engagement side, but also the walking away side with autocrats.
So then what do you think is the answer to the question I posed at the start? Is it possible to say, are allies or autocrats currently managing Trump better?
Well, I think what's happening is Trump is focused on the allies part. There hasn't been as much focus on trying to extract things from autocrats. I mean, obviously he wants sort of a peace agreement with Russia. He hasn't put a lot of pressure on Russia. There's now talk of tariffs against India for its purchase of Russian oil. That may also just be related to, the trade disagreements that we've seen with other, with the EU and others as well. But to me, what is sort of just very different is that it seems like Trump is trying to invert the relationship with allies. I think his perception is that allies have been extracting something from the US, have been acting as sort of parasites on US power, and now he wants that to go in the other direction. And so I think what has been sort of surprising, I would say, in the first 9 months of the Trump administration is that
Seven.
Yep. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
7. Feels like
like that. Is that, the China focus has been fairly limited. The Russia focus has been there, but about, trying to get a Nobel Peace Prize and about Ukraine. So I would say autocrats there's not been a lot of tension and they're, handling it pretty well, but allies, I think, have learned and adapted and are adopting a strategy that, the alliances still exist 7 months into the Trump administration. And it wasn't clear that was going to be the case, particularly, I think, from a European perspective at the beginning of the administration.
Yeah, I mean, I like Max's description of sort of inverting the relationship with allies. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think Trump looks at Asian and European allies and says, we provide security. They're cheating us on trade. We've been the victim. My primary tool is tariffs, right? And so you get a dynamic then when Trump is imposing these tariffs and allies are wanting to meet with him to try to cut a deal. So they're coming to him to try to cut a deal. And with adversaries, whatever you think of Donald Trump, like, he's trying to solve problems with these adversaries, like the North Korea problem, the Ukraine problem. Like, he really is trying to solve. So he's the one that's trying to engage with the adversaries. Like, he's the one that wants to meet with Putin in Alaska and doing all these things that, pull Russia out of the penalty box that many people say that's outrageous. He doesn't care. He'll do them. Same thing with Kim Jong-un. In the press availability on Monday, which went for like an hour, right? They spent most of the time talking about North Korea. I mean, the South Korean president baited him to start talking, but they spent most of the time talking about North Korea, Trump's good relationship with Kim, willingness to meet. This is normally a conversation that would happen behind closed doors, but purposefully he did it out in the public because he wanted Kim to hear it, right? And then at the same time, with Xi Jinping, like, there hasn't been much talk about China, but there's a lot of Asia stuff coming up in the fall. Like, we just had the Korea summit, there's ASEAN, there's APEC at the end of October, and then there's a Quad leaders meeting probably in the fall as well. So that's going to bring the president to the region. And even in this summit with Lee, he signaled like, oh, Xi Jinping wants me to come to China. So I think with adversaries, he's the one who's trying to engage them, whereas allies are trying to engage him.
It's interesting. So let's finish with the 3 quickfire questions as usual. So the first one, can you sum up efforts or allies' efforts to manage Trump in one word?
You go first.
Maybe obsequious, that they are, bending the knee.
Yeah.
They are just fawning over Trump.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's causing some domestic blowback. We're really going to leak.
Yeah, I would say, yes, they're definitely praising Trump, and using that praise to try to get deals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's up, who's down the most this week between the US, Russia, and China? Victor, starting with you. Who's had a good week?
I mean, I would have to say the U.S. had a good week. Certainly when it comes to my part of the world, they had a good week. So
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, Max.
Yeah, I think Russia is up. They had a summit with the president on U.S. soil. Wasn't a total win for Putin because they're in this kind of dance of who's to blame for the failure of there being any ceasefire, and I think Trump has largely recognized that Russia is the one bombing Ukraine. So so it's not a huge total win, but I think in general that was a good outcome for Putin.
Final one then. What word or phrase would you ban pundits from using, I guess, about summits, or Trump style of diplomacy, or just more broadly? You've each banned a few so far.
What word would you ban
people from using? Is there anything that annoys you that people keep saying?
No, I guess Nobel Peace Prize. I would be one, because I mean I do think it is sort of a real animator for Trump, but it is and I think therefore it needs to be discussed, but it's sort of ever present in why we're having peace talks that don't really have a lot of substance behind it.
So I would say it would probably be the one descriptor that's often used is no news is good news, right? Because that tells you that the diplomacy is not moving forward. Right?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So, Victor and Max, so you have described how Trump has inverted the relationship with allies. The allies are trying to come to the president because they want a deal. And they're also, I think, Max, you said that they're learning and they're adapting. So they're trying to avoid some of the early mistakes that were made. But I think, Victor, you pointed out that the success in public, in the Oval Office, doesn't always translate into substantive progress. As you said, by the lack of a written document that came out of this summit that we just had between President Lee and President Trump. And then when it comes to autocrats, I think President Trump really wants to engage with them. He wants to try to solve problems. And so far, that hasn't translated to a lot of success, but there will be plenty more opportunities for that in the months ahead, particularly as he heads to Asia. So we will certainly be watching that. And I look forward to discussing that with some of our other colleagues from across the center. So if you are enjoying State of Play, we'd be really grateful if you would rate it and review it wherever you listen to it. We're always open to suggestions of topics that you want to hear us cover. You can email geopolitics@csis.org. But otherwise, Victor, Max, thanks so much. See you next time. Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.